The greatest empire in history just crumbled, and most people don't even realize it happened. While headlines scream about tariffs and trade wars, something far more profound unfolded in the shadows of global finance. China's century-long blueprint for economic supremacy, carefully architected over decades, just hit a wall so massive that no amount of Belt and Road initiatives or WAN diplomacy can overcome it. We're not talking about military confrontation or dramatic sanctions. This is something far more elegant, far more devastating. The United States just deployed a financial weapon so sophisticated that Beijing's strategists are scrambling to comprehend what hit them. This isn't speculation or propaganda. The data is already visible in capital flows, sovereign debt restructuring, and the quiet panic rippling through China's banking sector. What makes this moment historically unprecedented is the precision. America didn't need aircraft carriers or economic isolation. Instead, they leveraged the one vulnerability every rising power possesses, the architecture of trust that underpins global commerce. And in doing so, they've potentially rewritten the rules of 21st century great power competition without a single shot fired. Let's break down exactly how this happened and why the implications will reshape everything you thought you knew about the New World Order. To understand what just transpired, we need to step back from the noise of daily headlines and look at the deeper currents that shape geopolitical reality. For the past 3 decades, China has been executing what might be the most ambitious economic strategy in human history. It wasn't just about manufacturing cheap goods or building ghost cities. It was about fundamentally restructuring the global economic order to position Beijing at its center. The Chinese Communist Party understood something that most Western analysts missed. Real power in the modern world doesn't come from the barrel of a gun. It comes from controlling the financial plumbing that makes global commerce possible. They watched how America wielded the dollar as a weapon, and they said to themselves, we need to build an alternative system, brick by brick, transaction by transaction, until one day the world wakes up and realizes they don't need Washington's permission anymore. This strategy had several pillars, and each one was carefully constructed over years of patient, methodical work. The Belt and Road Initiative wasn't just about building ports and railways across Asia, Africa, and Europe. It was about creating dependencies, about making dozens of countries so economically intertwined with China that they'd have no choice but to align with Beijing's interests when push came to shove. The Yuan internationalization campaign wasn't just about pride or prestige. It was about creating an alternative to dollar hegemony, about building a parallel financial system where transactions could flow without ever touching American banks or clearing through American infrastructure. The acquisition of strategic resources, the technology transfer agreements, the patient infiltration of international institutions, all of it pointed toward the same endgame, a world where China called the shots and America watched from the sidelines. And for a while, it was working brilliantly. Countries across the developing world were signing on to Belt and Road projects with enthusiasm. The yuan was slowly gaining acceptance in bilateral trade agreements. Chinese banks were expanding their international footprint. Western corporations were falling over themselves to access the Chinese market, often at the cost of transferring valuable technology and intellectual property. The narrative in elite circles was that America's unipolar moment was ending, that we were entering a multipolar world, and that China would inevitably become the dominant pole. You could see it in the confident pronouncements from Beijing, in the way Chinese diplomats carried themselves at international forums, in the long-term projections from think tanks and investment banks. The trajectory seemed clear, almost inevitable. But here's where the story takes a turn that most analysts didn't see coming. The United States, for all its apparent dysfunction and political chaos, still possesses institutional advantages that are nearly impossible to replicate. I'm not talking about military hardware or even GDP figures. I'm talking about something more fundamental: the deep infrastructure of trust and legal frameworks that underpin global finance. When you really drill down into how international commerce works, you discover that almost every significant transaction, almost every major financial flow, touches the dollar system at some point. It's not just that oil is priced in dollars or that central banks hold dollar reserves, it's that the entire architecture of contracts, clearing systems, insurance mechanisms, and legal recourse is built on foundations that took centuries to establish and that depend on a level of institutional credibility that you simply cannot manufacture overnight. China understood this vulnerability, which is precisely why they've been working so hard to build alternatives. But here's the thing about financial infrastructure. It's not just about having the technology or the capital, it's about trust. And trust is earned through decades of consistent, predictable behavior. It's about knowing that contracts will be enforced, that property rights will be respected, that the rules won't change arbitrarily based on political considerations. And this is where China's authoritarian system, for all its efficiency and long-term planning capabilities, runs into a fundamental limitation. When you have a system where the party can override any contract, seize any asset, or change any rule based on political necessity, you create an environment where sophisticated international actors will always maintain a certain distance, always keep one foot in the traditional Western-based system as a hedge against uncertainty. Now, what the United States just did, and this is where it gets really interesting, is they exploited this fundamental asymmetry in a way that's absolutely devastating. They didn't impose dramatic sanctions or start a trade war, though those elements played a supporting role. What they did was something far more subtle and far more powerful. They began systematically increasing the cost and risk of operating outside the dollar system, while simultaneously making it easier and more attractive to stay within it. Think about what this means in practical terms. If you're a major corporation or a sovereign wealth fund or a central bank, and you're considering whether to participate in China's alternative financial infrastructure, you now have to weigh not just the immediate transactional benefits, but also the long-term risks of being cut off from the deeper, more liquid, more legally secure dollar-based system. The genius of this approach is that it doesn't require explicit coercion. It's not about telling countries, you're either with us or against us. It's about creating a set of incentives where the rational choice, the choice that protects your interests and minimizes your risks, naturally leads you back toward the dollar system. And we're seeing this play out in real time across multiple dimensions. Look at what's happening with China's Belt and Road Initiative. Countries that signed up enthusiastically a few years ago are now finding themselves trapped in debt obligations they can't service, negotiating restructuring deals that effectively give China control over strategic assets. But here's the thing. Those same countries are now turning to Western institutions, to the IMF and World Bank, for rescue packages that come with their own conditions. The net effect is that China's grand strategy of creating dependencies is backfiring, creating resentment, and pushing countries back toward the traditional Western-led financial architecture. Or look at what's happening with the yuan internationalization effort. Despite years of aggressive promotion, the yuan still accounts for a tiny fraction of global transactions compared to the dollar. And that fraction isn't growing the way Beijing hoped it would. In fact, recent data shows it's actually plateaued or even declined in certain categories. Why? Because when push comes to shove, when there's real money at stake, sophisticated actors choose liquidity and legal certainty over political alignment. They choose the system where they know the rules, where they have recourse if something goes wrong, where centuries of case law and institutional experience provide a foundation of predictability. China can build all the infrastructure it wants, but it can't manufacture that kind of deep institutional trust on a timeline measured in years or even decades. What makes this moment particularly significant is that it's happening just as China is facing a confluence of internal challenges that are limiting its ability to respond effectively. The property sector crisis isn't just about Evergrande or a few over-leveraged developers. It's a fundamental unraveling of the growth model that powered China's rise for the past 3 decades. That model depended on continuously expanding debt to finance ever larger infrastructure and property development projects, creating a cycle where growth today was purchased by mortgaging tomorrow. As long as the cycle continued, as long as property values kept rising and local governments could keep selling land to finance their operations, the model worked. But now that the cycle is breaking, now that property values are falling and developers are defaulting and local governments are drowning in debt, the whole edifice is shaking. And this isn't happening in isolation, it's coinciding with demographic collapse that's going to reshape China's economic trajectory for generations. The one-child policy, which seemed like a rational response to overpopulation concerns decades ago, has created a demographic time bomb that's now exploding. China's working-age population is shrinking, and it's shrinking fast. The dependency ratio, the number of retirees versus workers, is deteriorating rapidly. This means that just as China needs economic dynamism to navigate its debt crisis and maintain social stability, it's facing a demographic headwind that's going to make growth increasingly difficult. You can't build an economy around endless property development when your population is shrinking. You can't maintain the kind of export-driven growth that powered your rise when your labor force is contracting and aging. Beijing understands these challenges, which is why they've been trying to pivot toward higher value manufacturing, toward technology and innovation, toward moving up the value chain. But here again, they're running into barriers that the United States has quietly reinforced. The restrictions on semiconductor technology transfers, the scrutiny of Chinese investments in sensitive sectors, the pressure on allies to limit Chinese access to critical technologies, all of this is making China's attempted transition much more difficult. And crucially, it's doing so in a way that doesn't look like naked protectionism or Cold War-style containment. It's framed as legitimate national security concerns, as protecting critical infrastructure, as ensuring supply chain resilience. And because it's framed this way, because it's embedded in broader concerns that resonate with allied countries who have their own reasons to be wary of Chinese technological ambitions, it's created a coalition of limitations that Beijing is finding very difficult to overcome. Now, let's talk about what this means for the dollar's role in the global system, because this is really the heart of the matter. For years, we've been hearing predictions about the dollar's imminent demise, about how the Fed's money printing and America's fiscal irresponsibility and political dysfunction would inevitably lead to a flight from the dollar into alternative reserve currencies. And you know what? Those predictions made a certain kind of sense. If you just looked at the fundamentals, the debt levels, the deficits, the political polarization, you'd think the dollar should be in trouble. But the reality is that the dollar's dominance has, if anything, strengthened in recent years. And it's strengthened precisely because there's no viable alternative. The euro can't play this role because the eurozone lacks the political unity and fiscal integration necessary to back a true reserve currency. You need a deep, liquid sovereign debt market, and you need the political will to run the kinds of deficits that provide that liquidity to the global system. Europe doesn't have that and isn't going to have it anytime soon. The yuan can't play this role because China's capital controls and political system create fundamental questions about convertibility and property rights that make sophisticated actors nervous about holding large yuan positions. And there's no other currency that even comes close to having the scale and liquidity necessary to serve as a global reserve. So what we're witnessing is actually a remarkable validation of dollar dominance at precisely the moment when it was supposed to be declining. And the United States is leveraging this position in increasingly sophisticated ways. They're not just wielding the dollar as a blunt instrument. They're using it as a precision tool to shape global economic flows in ways that reinforce American strategic interests while creating costs and risks for those who would build alternative systems. This is financial statecraft at its most refined, and it's proving devastatingly effective against China's challenge. But here's what makes this even more profound. This isn't just about economics or finance, it's about the broader question of what kind of world order we're going to have in the 21st century. China's vision was of a world where authoritarian efficiency could outcompete democratic messiness, where the party's ability to make long term plans and execute them without worrying about elections or public opinion would prove superior to the chaotic, short term thinking of Western democracies. And for a while, that vision seemed plausible. Look at how quickly China built its high speed rail network, how efficiently it could mobilize resources for massive infrastructure projects, how effectively it could direct capital toward strategic priorities. But what we're seeing now is the limits of that model. Authoritarian systems can be very effective at mobilizing resources for specific, well defined goals, but they struggle with the kind of distributed decision making, the kind of genuine innovation, the kind of dynamic adaptation that comes from having millions of actors making independent choices based on their own assessments of risk and opportunity. China's top down approach could copy and scale existing technologies brilliantly, but it's proving much less effective at generating the next wave of truly transformative innovations. And crucially, it can't build the kind of institutional trust that underpins a genuine alternative to the dollar-based international order. What the United States has effectively done is demonstrate that for all the talk about American decline, for all the very real challenges that the country faces, the fundamental advantages of the Western system, the rule of law, the independence of institutions, the protection of property rights, the framework of trust that these things create, still matter enormously in a globalized world. You can't just will an alternative financial architecture into existence through central planning and strategic investment. You need the deeper foundation of credibility and predictability that comes from centuries of institutional development, and that depends on political systems that limit arbitrary power. And this is having ripple effects far beyond just the US-China relationship. Countries around the world are watching this unfold and drawing their own conclusions. The bet that many of them were making, that they could hedge between the American and Chinese systems, that they could take Chinese investment while maintaining their ties to Western markets and institutions, that bet is becoming increasingly untenable. The costs of trying to straddle both systems are rising, the contradictions are becoming sharper, and increasingly countries are finding that when they're forced to choose, they're choosing the system that offers deeper liquidity, stronger legal protections, and more reliable institutional frameworks, even if that means accepting American influence and occasionally American interference. This doesn't mean China is defeated or finished, far from it. China is still a massive economy with tremendous strengths and capabilities. But what it does mean is that the specific strategy China was pursuing, the path to displacing American leadership through building parallel financial infrastructure and creating dependencies through economic statecraft, that path is now blocked. The United States has successfully defended the core elements of its systemic advantage without having to resort to direct military confrontation or economically catastrophic decoupling. They've done it through sophisticated financial statecraft, through leveraging institutional advantages, through creating incentive structures that channel global capital flows back toward dollar-based systems, even as they maintain nominal openness to alternatives. And the beautiful thing, from a strategic perspective, is that this approach is largely invisible to casual observers. If you're just reading headlines about trade tensions or diplomatic spats, you miss the deeper game that's being played. You miss how every seemingly technical decision about banking regulations or securities clearance or technology transfer protocols is actually part of a larger strategy to reinforce the dollar system's centrality and increase the costs of operating outside it. This is grand strategy executed at a level of sophistication that's genuinely impressive. And it's working precisely because it doesn't look like the kind of dramatic confrontation that would trigger nationalist backlash or force fence-sitting countries to pick sides publicly. The implications of this shift are going to reverberate for decades. We're not just talking about the balance of power between the United States and China. We're talking about fundamental questions about how the global economy is organized, about what kinds of political systems can successfully compete in an interconnected world, about whether authoritarian efficiency can ultimately triumph over democratic messiness. And what we're seeing is that the answer might be more nuanced than either the triumphalists or the declinists believed. Yes, democracies have real weaknesses and inefficiencies. Yes, America faces genuine challenges and dysfunctions. But the institutional foundations that democracies build, the frameworks of law and trust and predictability, these turn out to matter enormously when the chips are down and serious money is at stake. China will undoubtedly adapt and respond. They're too smart and too strategically sophisticated not to. But they're now playing from a weakened position, having to deal with internal economic challenges while simultaneously trying to overcome systemic disadvantages in the international arena. And the United States, for all its problems, has successfully defended the high ground of global finance without having to fight the kind of direct confrontation that could have spiraled into something much more dangerous. That's a strategic victory of the highest order, achieved without firing a shot, executed so subtly that most people don't even realize it happened. And that's precisely what makes it so effective and so significant for the future of the international order.